Sean Khorsandi. I'm from Landmark West. I've done a few of these so far. The first one was about a style, covering the modern. The next one was about covering a process, stirring the pot, basically how to get people aware of what's going on in their neighborhood. And now today is about an unfortunate phenomenon, but we're going to take a little bit of a wide view for it. When we were brainstorming what to do for today, I wanted to play devil's advocate, so I'm going onto the dark side, and I'm going to start off by advocating, or maybe taking the position that maybe these are okay, and what they do that is positive, and then we'll take that all apart. So first of all is the question of definitions, and we created a web page on our site. It's landmarkwest.org/SUPERTALLS, and it covers a lot of the history of how we grew in size, how the technology developed, what the definitions are, what are concerns, what are advocates doing about it. There's a series of criteria covered, but one of the more important things is what is a super tall, and that all depends on your definition. So a tall building, the mainly accepted constructs are a tall building is something 40 stories creates a tower, something of 984 feet and above creates a super tall, and then the threshold of 968 is a mega tall. And these are terms brought to us by a group out of Chicago called the Council on Tall Buildings. And this is a question of, do we subscribe to that language even? Do we allow them to direct the conversation? And we've had a lot of feedback from our community saying they should be excessively talls, too talls, and we should flip the script. The reality is a super tall is whatever is head and shoulders above the context in your neighborhood, and we go into that in our district. So for example, in Landmark West's district, which is the Upper West Side of Manhattan, there are two super talls. One has just topped out, 200 Amsterdam at 668 feet, and the other one that's threatened is 775 feet. Neither of those qualify by the Council of Tall Buildings standards, but each one in their own block or super block where they reside is more than twice as tall as its context. So in 2018, there were 18 super tall buildings recorded, more than any single year had previously. Right now, worldwide, there are 150, and there are 196 in planning stages.
Could you repeat those numbers?
There are 150 super talls worldwide. Worldwide. 3 of them are megatalls, and currently in planning stages or construction stages are 196, and that includes 11.
Super tall or megatall?
196 super tall, and of those 196, 11 of those are megatalls. So when all is said and done, as everybody has voiced and planned so far, there will be 14 megatalls worldwide. And we will likely never see a megatall in New York City, and there's reasons for that, but we will likely see many more super talls, and we'll talk about that. So where did this all start? And it's always fun to start with religion. If you go to the book of Genesis, there's the whole story about the Tower of Babel and building high. Come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered upon the face of the whole earth. This is a little bit about the creation of the world. In this case, building tall was problematic for them. Other people, playing devil's advocate like Edward Glaser, a Harvard professor, believes that skyscrapers can solve the city. Now, this is all taken with a big asterisk. This article is from 2011. We started seeing the first vestiges of super talls in New York in the current wave in 2005 with the planning stages for 157th Street by Gary Barnett Extel Development. But super talls have existed in New York City since the 30s. We have the Chrysler Building, which reaches that criteria, and the Empire State Building. We obviously also have the original Twin Towers. But in each case, those were civic buildings pushing a separate agenda, right? The Empire State Building was creating jobs, and it was derided as the empty state building because it wasn't filled until the 1940s, and it didn't turn a profit till later into the 40s. And the Chrysler Building was setting a tone of the skyline and sort of celebrating the city. Arguably, when the original World Trade Center was built, that was an engineering feat that we could even do it. But the problem with today's super talls is largely that they're residential in nature. They're to be occupied by few, and they're restrictive. They're also a push towards further gentrification. So Glaser, an urbanist who decamped himself to the suburbs, has a little bit of that Jane Jacobs syndrome, right? She loved New York and then left for Toronto. But he's talking about skyscrapers and not necessarily super talls, but many of his concepts apply, and some of the basic rules carry through. So looking at height, and we go through in depth on our website the evolution of height. It used to be spires and masts, right? You saw the big ship masts in the harbor, and you saw the spires of churches. And of those, Trinity Church was the tallest at 281 feet to the tip of the spire. And that number is a little contested because in various research I was looking at today, I found 3 different heights for the towers of the Brooklyn Bridge, which supplanted it. But in New York, the tallest building stayed Richard Upjohn's Trinity Church up until 1890, when the Post building for the World, which was one of the newspapers, it's currently, if you go downtown, this is the site of Pace University, and it was torn down partly to widen the entrance and access for the Brooklyn Bridge. So these were some of the first skyscrapers in New York on Park Row, and the idea was suddenly media overtaking religion, and maybe that was a seismic shift, a conceptual shift, however you want to do it. But it was a change of priorities for society nonetheless. Similarly, the tallest building in Europe, the tallest structure, was the Eiffel Tower, and this eclipsed the spires of Notre Dame. And again, this was an engineering feat. It was a symbol of the city, and it was done as part of a celebration. This was not meant to be inhabited. So this was something moving forward, moving the typology forward, understanding mechanics and engineering. But a confluence of a bunch of different ideas came together to form the skyscraper. There's the ideas of form following function that came from Louis Sullivan and then his pupil, Frank Lloyd Wright, married with the innovations of new steel methods, fireproofing, the introduction of the elevator. Really people could only go as far as their legs could carry them. And suddenly cities were able to create a much denser supply of buildings in city centers. And this was a godsend to many. And when you consider it in the range of where we were going and what we needed, it created a lot of opportunity, right? If you think about it today, not everybody can live in the city core. And the ideas right now of Manhattan sort of decanting in a certain way, or at least the business district, solely for businesses, these are ideas that were started under the Giuliani era, and some of the evolution is still taking place. So we're part of a system of different ideas and different priorities. And part of those priorities are interesting because they've shifted over time. And you probably don't recognize Abram Lefcourt on the left. You might have seen his name on different buildings. There was the Lefcourt National Bank. He was a poor Jewish boy. He was a bootblack, and he sort of came into money on his own. He earned it himself, and he became a developer. And nobody thinks of him as a bad developer. Abraham E. Lefcourt. And he likely tore down more historically worthy buildings than any other individual in New York history. But he believed that there should be new humane working conditions, both for owners and factory workers. And he was in the garment district and the garment industry. And part of the construction of the Brill building was twofold. But the idea was to give more humane working conditions, more efficient use of space, better. Not everybody was working in a hovel, not everybody had to be in dark quarters, there was better flow. And in order to do that and to provide that, we needed to redevelop things. On this site, you may not recognize it from these, but the Colony neon on the right might give it away. This is the Brill building. It was initially, at one point, planned to be the world's tallest structure. And obviously that didn't happen. It topped out at 11 stories. And the Brill brothers had a garment trade store that lasted about 50 years. And they actually worked out on land lease, and they stole the building from Lefcourt. And it's sad on 2 levels, partly because if you look at the detail with it, this was intended to be a memorial to his son, Alan, who died of anemia in February of 1930. And the Brill building is important for many reasons, right? This is where jazz moved forward, right? This is where we got Twist and Shout, and You've Lost That Love and Feeling, and maybe also appropriately Up on the Roof. So by building up, Lefcourt was able to improve the lives of garment workers who were initially intended to be there, but also create new spaces for creative minds. And what's that threshold of what the city is, right? Is it the people? Is it the buildings? Is it the events that happen there? And so we can't be anti-development in every right, and here, developing higher and more efficiently, using these tools and strategies worked for good. Unfortunately, for Left Court, it was also the cause of, it was poorly timed. In 1930, he had all these investments and he lost them. So over a 20-year period, he would erect over 30 buildings, many of them were skyscrapers, and in many of them he used some of the newest technologies, such as Otis's elevators, and in all, his buildings covered more than 150 acres. So he encased 100 million cubic feet, and his buildings contained as many workers as the city of Trenton. So the Wall Street Journal, and I alluded to this before, is quoted as saying, he demolished more historical landmarks in New York City than any other man had dared to contemplate. Ironically, the Brill Building is now a landmark,
Yes.
and it's soon to be a very large CVS.
So he built this,
He built the Brill Building.
I thought the brothers.
The brothers held the lease to it, and they stole it from him when it was nearly finished. They foreclosed on it.
Oh, that's how they got it.
But he was responsible for many of these Art Deco buildings, and people didn't react or deride him in the same way one might challenge a developer today. So, but also at that time, New Yorkers did start to complain. Fifth Avenue was turning from mansions to commercial pursuits, and the people who lived and worked there, or were starting to work there, felt that there should be a 125-foot height limit, which is obscene, right? That's 12 stories. We would laugh at that today. But we also saw new regulations, new developments, such as the Equitable Building, which is where city planning, ironically, is today in a Silverstein property. And this had cut so much light and air to the street that a lot of the neighboring businesses felt that they were owed something. They were owed reparations of some kind. And because of this building, in 1916, New York City set up the first zoning code, the building code. And you'll see in a diagram on the right, there were different tiers of 1 time, 2 time, 1.5 time. It was a very simple system, but it also created setbacks based on the street width. So this was the idea that there was always light and air to the street. And at a certain point, we stopped worrying about that. So other pieces came and left, right? 14 years after we got zoning, we started to see the beginning of the Empire State Building and planning, which, as I mentioned, was not profitable until the 40s. And it was really in the 30s that New York got its building boom in terms of skyscrapers. And after this, the regulations started to get more complex. And with the additional complexity, the zoning code changed as well. So although it began in 1916, by 1960, the zoning code had been amended and updated more than 2,500 times. And this is a time before the internet. I searched tons of searchable PDFs today in preparing this, and in a given day's work, Will helped as well. People weren't able to do that back then. You literally looked at books, and you looked at handouts, and you looked at prints and mimeofaxes and everything else, but you didn't just have the same searchability we have today. And then everything changed in 1961. 1961 gave us the new zoning. And the new zoning code provided a number of things, but among them it created an idea of floor area ratio. And floor area ratio is where the SUPERTALLS get their fangs, let's say. And there's attitudes about how that happened. Simultaneously with this, and I know this is 1961 and this example began in the 1940s, but we started seeing things like Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village, large urban renewal area things. And I know this was partly a MetLife project, but this was a early public-private sort of enterprise. And after World War II, New York made a lot of private development more difficult, partly by over-regulating. They were starting to regulate construction methods, they were starting to regulate rents, and at the same time, they were also, I don't want to say flooding the market, but they were creating housing and a new bevy of public initiatives at a rate unseen in prior New York history. So examples of that are Stuytown, which was a model for new living, and it was for the working class. It was middle class enclave, it was intended, and Lincoln Center. So when you think about this, in 1940 we had 7.45 million people. We're hovering at 8.6 right now. So 80 years.
I think we're,
I
we also have an undercount.
8.6
Plus, there's an
documented.
awful lot of people who are undocumented too.
And there's a lot of B&T who come in every day, I know.
And also an exodus going on, so.
From certain neighborhoods, and I'll touch on that. So things like this, obviously there's no housing in Lincoln Center, it displaced a lot of people. And part of the problem is that New York City isn't really building anything, hardly even infrastructure, some would argue. And maybe if we still were, we wouldn't be in some of the conditions we are. And some of the supply side economic people feel we just need to provide more housing, and SUPERTALLS are great. How could you be against this? Rents are, quote, too damn high, right? So suddenly, somehow, SUPERTALLS will solve the problem. And the reality is SUPERTALLS are not built for normal people with normal incomes, so they're not solving the problem. One of the arguments against this, from the flip side, obviously I'm a detective on the dark side, undercover. He has stilts. He wants to be a SUPERTALL. Is the idea of supply and demand, right? If you had a 40-story building, likely you could fit more people, but it also changes the character. And this is the chicken and the egg, or maybe the crucial challenge or the bet you want to make, right? How do you maintain the character? By maintaining the character, you, in essence, by the economists argue, decrease affordability. And in the places that are expensive and they don't build a lot, we wind up with this imbalance. The places where it's cheap, we start building a lot of housing. So that's why Houston's more affordable and so many people are moving to Texas. So it's growth, not height restrictions, and a fixed building stock that keeps the space affordable and ensures that the poor people and less profitable firms can stay and help a thriving city remain successful and diverse. And the concept of this is the corporations who can afford it will move to the higher end, newer buildings, and they will free up office space, which will then be available at lower tiers. This is the economist side, right? By that same thinking, if we just gridded in Central Park, we could solve the housing crisis, right? Build more housing. The YIMBYs would claim that the yes in my backyard, that building in a dense area, you save green space because by building on top of people, you're not taking over new virgin land. Well, the reality is there's no virgin land left in New York City. It's built. All of it's built. So those basic tenets and arguments don't apply. And the sense of that urbanists have of American cities, you have to take New York City out of the equation. We're an American metropolis, right? And that maybe those rules apply to American cities. They don't apply to American metropoli. I was in Dover, Delaware this weekend, and I'm not bragging. I know everybody's jealous. The population is something like 37,000 people. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what they do because there's nothing to do there. There is a Waffle House. But we're not in a city, we're in a metropolis. So in terms of spaces visited by tourists, where the hordes descend, the number one most visited place in America is the Vegas Strip. Followed by the number 2 is Times Square, and the number 3 is Central Park. And most people are heading to the bottom 10 blocks of Central Park. And it's so popular in a way that this urban green space is being inundated by tourism, and it's being run out faster than it should. They can't keep the fields and lawns green. They're trampling plantings. So this does challenge that argument of the YIMBYs as well. Like, it's not preserving green space. There is a certain point where overdensity is overdensity, and it's not a good thing. The other argument is, well, density is good because it allows for diversity. And historic districts are bad. And I'm not saying this, I'm taking that position because I know this is being recorded and I will get letters. In the year 2000, people who lived in historic districts in Manhattan were on average 74% wealthier than people who lived outside of these same areas. Almost 3/4 of the adults living in these districts had college degrees as opposed to 54% of those living outside of them. They were also 20% more likely to be white. So the concept of building more homes would ease the impact and demand and make cities more affordable. It's almost as if they're taking us on a ride and then they flip the discussion to say we must build more, and suddenly we'll have diversity. And it depends on what kind of diversity you're talking about. The cheapest thing to build is a 2-story stick-built house in America. You build these on a former potato field or what have you, and they cost $84 a square foot. To build in New York City, once you reach the 7th floor, the average is about $400 a square foot. And the benefit is the more you stack on top of that building, once the land acquisition is already paid for, you're just distributing that initial cost less. You're diluting your original investment costs. So you're getting a greater rate of return every time you build more, build another stack. So on the left, we have one of those $84 per square foot houses, and on the right, you have something that's 4.7 times the cost, right? And you have to keep in mind, when you build in New York, you have additional costs, not only to clear the site, because you're likely taking down an existing building, but then preparing the site, remediating the site. You're doing all this on active streets used by other people. There's legal fees. More often than not, you're hiring a fancy architect. And
Soft costs.
not to complain against the stick-built house, people more often than not are choosing those from a factory or a catalog of pre-made set designs, and they're not paying an individual architect. It might be an in-house architect for a builder. So the cost is going to be quite expensive, but you start to recoup more of your costs the higher you build into the heavens. Once you reach the 7th floor, you might as well keep going. That's really the concept. And I point out, you can't see the cursor here, but on the left-hand side, you see the first setback with the railing of Bob Stern's 220 Central Park South. And what you can't really make out in this photo is that floors 3, 4, 5, and 6 have a little bit of a frosted glass. Those are mechanical space. And why would you do that? Well, I can basically if you move the floor area for a residential unit from the 3rd floor and suddenly elevate it to 7, you're selling a 7th story view, not a 3rd story view, and it's worth more. So they're essentially increasing their value just by rearranging where parts of the innards of the building go. This is just part of plain economics. And once you've built that infrastructure, cleared that site, everything above that is gravy, and it gets exponentially more lucrative the higher you go. So that's a close-up on the left, and on the right, that's it from a distance before the Nordstrom Tower, which is rising behind it. And this is part of the argument, right? You have to still go through the same zoning rules, you still have to go through the same air rights acquisition, the same height restrictions, the same landmark boards, and web of regulation that makes building more difficult. So once you've cleared those hurdles, the argument is, why not max it out?
Wait, what's exactly on those first 3 floors?
The first floor is, it's a concierge. I think there's refrigerated storage because everybody accepts fresh direct orders because you can't even be home when you're scheduling a 2-hour window anymore. So I don't know what's on 2, it's likely offices, but 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all mechanical for the build.
That many? That's a lot of floors being mechanical.
And this is part of the argument. 432 Park Avenue has 19
On
mechanical
the entire
floors.
front, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The windows are,
They look like shower glass. They're
there's
frosted.
nobody there. That's right.
Wow.
And so what's the flip side, right? Singapore preserves nearly nothing. And in fact, they're even clearing cemeteries and graveyards. They don't prevent construction at all. Their downtown functions well because it's tall, it's connected, and business people can run from meeting to meeting in another building very quickly. We're a little more dispersed, but there has to be some happy medium between the two. So the YIMBY model of how to do this is simple. It's 3 steps. They say, how do we make this better? Well, just charge people. Instead of having a developer come in and have to hire a lobbyist and hire lawyers, just figure out what the cost is of the taking. What is the cost of the view, the added shadow we're casting? The problem with this is that it's a one-time cost, and then if I accept that money and sell my apartment, the person from then until perpetuity is going to be living in shadow. They're saying instead of having everything fought out in court and different agencies and delay, just come up with a fee structure and make it transparent up front. The YIMBY argument would also say limit historic district designations. They say there's too many, flat out. 15% of Manhattan below 96th Street is protected either by individual or historic district designations. And most developers want to develop in Manhattan, so this is a hardship for them. It's hard for them to do their job. And the flip side is then they should also give more power to the people, and you should decide what happens on your block. Well, the problem with that concept is how do you ever get a hospital or the things a city needs whether it be a halfway house, a Target, a big box, a supermarket, because nobody really wants to live next to that, or a bus station.
Right, or a school.
People are less
Residential
against
block.
schools.
You don't want a school across the street.
Unless it's at the base of your tower, and then it can give you a better view. So you have to consider the carbon emissions that are significantly lower in big cities versus the outlying suburbs. And as of 2007, the life expectancy of someone in New York City was 1.5 times higher than the rest of the nation as a whole. So maybe all of these bus fumes that we're breathing are not really carbon emissions, and we're all doing things healthier for ourselves. But another side of this argument is that technology is aiding growth. We're looking at a core with columns on the outside with an exterior frame or tube construction. Tube construction allowed us to move higher partly because buildings sway. Just as an oak tree would sway in a wind so it doesn't break, buildings are meant to sway. But the problem as you go higher and more slender is that the more buildings sway, people inside start to feel sick.
Yes.
So there's a number of things that can stabilize them, but there's also a problem, right? Historically, we were limited by masonry, and you needed a really heavy base and core, and it would get thinner as you went up. Steel allowed us to break that cycle, but the tubes have allowed us to move it even further. There's a tertiary system that's even been developed, which is called the buttressed core. And this is where the core works in different parts, like spokes working together, solidifying and stabilizing the center. You might also see buildings as you cross over that any sharp corner edges might have a reveal or a cutaway at floor between windows. This is done by design to let air pass through so it's not hitting so hard. If you look in Hong Kong, there's a lot of buildings with what we call Rachi holes. They have an inner court maybe halfway up the body and the whole building looks like an O, and this is just also to let air pass through so it's not all hitting the surface hard. So structural technology is allowing for this typology to evolve. We also have other innovations. So just like Otis stunned everyone in Bryant Park when he exhibited his safety elevator and he had someone with an axe chop at the cord to release the elevator where safety caught in place with him on it. We're now looking at double stacked or twinned elevators. And this new arrangement allows people to move it allows buildings to move 40% more passengers than a conventional elevator. And it does it by organizing the buttons. Sometimes when there's not enough people, one will be at rest either at the top or at the bottom of its run. But you essentially have 2 elevators running in one shaft. Well, the benefit of that is on a smaller site, you can get twice or 40% more people going up and down because you have 2 running in the same shaft. It also creates a question of if anybody gets stuck, but we're not worrying about safety, we're just worrying about efficiency. And efficiency is, my real estate and what I pay for. And if I keep having cores hollowing out my building, I'm not gonna have enough to sell. So here we've got technology moving to improve the saleability, essentially, of a building. You may have also seen these before, where when you get into a building today, you press what floor you're going to, and then it tells you where to go. And what this does is called destination dispatch. So instead of having everybody stopping at multiple floors, it groups them so it creates more efficiency within the run. And so technology is moving forward. What happens when we lose power and technology goes out? I'm hoping I'm not around for that. On top of this, we have concrete. So on the left, the Romans gave us concrete, and concrete was started with a bunch of different things, mainly garbage and rubble infill. They had great sand from volcanic ash called tufa. They mixed this with face brick. Sometimes they'd even put some fancier stones, sometimes travertine on the outside. Rome didn't have the great marble that the Hellenic kingdom did. Sometimes they just make patterns and leave it. Well, right now, we're using new types of fiber. We're using new chemicals, admixtures, and microfibers, allowing the structure to be thinner. And what's the benefit of concrete? We have a tall, big building. Why do I want to do this so heavy? Well, concrete not only helps deaden the sound between floors, it also helps stabilize. So when you're swaying, it's better for tall buildings. It's also a layer of fireproofing built in. So if you did steel, you have the added layer and cost labor of spraying all that steel and then encasing it in double layers of sheetrock for a 2-hour rating. Here, you don't have to encase the sheetrock. You'll put your finished floor on it, so there's an efficiency. You're not building as heavy either. So this new carbon fiber technology that we're seeing is used right now in jet aircrafts and racing bikes. So this is really the future of construction. So we're moving all these new materials forward. So that's great. Industry's keeping up, right? Part of my concern is not all of these are tested. And now that we're testing them at hundreds of feet in the sky above active sidewalks and streets. Another concept is the idea of vortex shedding. And a lot of this has been a guess in the past. What happens when the wind hits the building? How does the wind work around the mass? And what does that wind flow do to disturb the buildings around it? Or other features. You know, if you have a smaller terracotta building next to this and this building's getting pummeled and suddenly all that air is being directed to them, you're harming your historic building. Well, now they're looking at ways of changing the design of the building and the structuring to allow the wind to flow around it. So this is why we're maybe seeing more shapely buildings, maybe things like the Gherkin. But this allows us to work on a computer level to test out and make buildings safer. The other question is the chicken and the egg. We don't have to make we're inviting a nuisance that we're trying to solve. Really, so the 3D modeling is a new way to justify what we're doing. Unfortunately, the rules have not kept up. So right now, while a developer might be doing that for their own interest, it's not part of the code. And when people are looking at it, they're often looking at this vortex shedding in a vacuum. Literally, they're looking at their building. When you have something like Billionaire's Row coming or a clustering of SUPERTALLS, there's a cumulative impact, and nobody's really studying that. The one thing that comes out of this is the promise of jobs. With all the good and with all the financial stats, we have jobs. But the question is, you know, these are temporary jobs, and how long do they last? And what's the benefit for these jobs when the construction workers leave and you have a building that is less than half occupied in perpetuity, or at least that's what the market's doing right now. So it all comes down to the concept of economics driving this, right? We're creating jobs, we're creating design jobs, we're using new materials, we're advancing technology. There's jobs in demolition, there's jobs in carting, there's jobs in people who serve lunch to construction workers. But the bigger question is not economics, but economics. And who's buying these? What's the purpose of these? And the reality is they're not here to, in fact, ease congestion nor affordability. They're here for the super rich to have bragging rights. There are currently over 2,200 billionaires in the world out of a population of 7.3 billion people. And the rate of billionaires is growing exponentially. The idea is the population of the world will increase to 9 billion by 2050, and of these 9 billion people, 70% are expected to live in urban areas. The problem with them right now, the SUPERTALLS, is that these SUPERTALLS are super exclusive, and if your argument is that a dense urban core should be dense, you create density. You don't create buildings which are only accessible to the few. So if you start looking at the global millionaire population, Monaco is trimmed off. They have a lot of millionaires, but they're not as rich. America, we have the world's richest man running Amazon and everything else, the Washington Post. So the spread of income disparity is expected to grow as well. In New York City, height is only a means of density to a point, and that's mainly because we have something called the multiple dwelling law. So again, millionaires in the US growing, millions of millionaires, literally. And views sell. I'm going to get back to multiple dwelling law, don't worry. And the economics of a building is that the taller you go, the more financially viable it is, and the greater rate of return. And this is a view for one of the select few out of one of those buildings in Billionaire's Row. You don't have to see the riffraff around you or the buildings around you. You get just this amazing front lawn. And the concept is everything that you see lining left and right are largely built with a 10-foot floor-to-floor height. But the current standard for these SUPERTALLS is 16'5". And this is partly to Bogart the view. And this is a term I'm hoping everybody takes on to. This is really a Humphrey Bogartism because he often kept a cigarette in his mouth, but would never really smoke it. But it's the idea of taking something all for yourself so others can't have it. And that's really
his real name, too.
It wasn't a stage name.
It's not a stage name.
So we have to West Side.
That's right. It was
Yeah.
that was that.
I guess we'll
It's actually a Dutch name.
Yeah.
So
It was adopted.
keeping this idea of Bogarting the view, how much of the view can I take? Well, it is limited by the multiple dwelling law. And I know I don't like reading notes. I have a few, if you will indulge me. The multiple dwelling law, this version of it I have dates to 29. It is hereby declared that the intensive occupation of multiple dwelling sites, overcrowding of multiple dwelling rooms, inadequate provision for light and air, and insufficient protection against the defective provision for escape from fire, and improper sanitation of multiple dwellings in certain areas of the state are a menace to health, safety, morals, welfare, and reasonable comfort of the citizens of the state, and that the establishment and maintenance of proper housing standards requiring sufficient light, air, sanitation, and protection from fire hazards are essential to the public welfare. This only applies in New York State to cities. It applies to all cities with a population exceeding 325,000 or more. How many cities in New York State have a population of 325,000 or more? One. The next most dense is Buffalo with just over 250,000. So this is really just built for New York. And the idea is it's regulating the density of housing units you can have on a site. And there's concerns, right? This is because we were worried about light and air. We were worried about crowding and congestion. We were worried about fire safety. We were worried about life safety and essentially getting those required services to where they needed to be. And while the infrastructure is here, now that we have this density and crowding restricting passage, we have longer lead times. So yes, everybody can all be in the same spot, but if you have an ambulance that can't get to you because everybody's in that spot, it's not helping you. The other side is, in terms of bogarting, what happens when I'm on the 96th floor of a building and I have a heart attack during a power outage? So now suddenly I'm expecting all these services to take their time climbing up to get me because I called first. In the meantime, other people who might be having emergencies are not being served. So looking at this is just our homepage. We are focusing on SUPERTALLS all the time. And I'm going to be talking a lot about this one building in particular, the Central Park Tower. So given all this, with all the good, right, we have new jobs created, we have density, we're saving green space, we're housing people. Why not just let it ride and see what happens? But let's think about this for a minute before we do. The 5 boroughs in New York City are just over 205,000 acres. And economically, the sales drive the real estate industry, so what could possibly go wrong? Well, we must tear something down first to build something new. In this case, this was a 5-story building that was 176 years old. It was a warehouse between John and Platt Streets that survived the Great Fire of 1835 and every other calamity that befell Lower Manhattan until 2007. If you look just next to it, 211 only stayed, and it's a facadeism. They're using it to cover an entrance to a parking garage for 2 Gold Street on the other side of the block. And that's because this was an early warehouse for Colgate-Palmolive. It was associated with a famous brand, so it stayed. So it was not a landmark. They tore it down. I was reading about this going down a rabbit hole today. There was all sorts of fancy brickwork in it. And this is what it looks like today from Google Street View. It would have been the middle section right there above where it says Google. And the quote from David Dunlap at the time was, "Given the new jobs and businesses that will be created in its wake, the loss of 213 Pearl Street will almost certainly help make New York an even wealthier city, but it will leave New York a poorer city too." And this is the question of density and height, and clearly a district that up until the early aughts was still 3 and 4 stories. So what else is at stake? Nonprofits are being targeted. Provisions meant to help them are being used to prey on them. So the idea of the community facility bonus in particular has stripped some buildings in a very short radius in the Upper West Side. On the right is the American Bible Society that had been in New York for 199 years that sold out. On the upper left is the Lincoln Square Synagogue, which I call it the cookie jar, and that is now the site of 200 Amsterdam, the 668-foot tower. They did a land swap. And on the bottom left is Congregation Habonim, which also did a land swap and is allowing for the development of the tower I'm talking to you about.
Where's that?
That is 36 to 50 West 66th Street. That used to be 50 West 66th, I believe, or 44 was the specific address. That's the lot. It's the Central Park West to Columbus block. And it's also creating a lot of waste, right? This is the Union Carbide site originally. It was made lead silver in 2012, and it will be the largest controlled demolition in the history of humanity. This is just north of the Pan Am building on Park Avenue, and it's going to be torn down, 700-foot building, so they can add 500 feet to it. And it's in good company, right? There's lots of other tall buildings.
That was a 50-story building, right?
It was
Carbide, yeah.
Just about. I think it was just under. So there's a history of tearing down tall buildings all around the world. But this is also coming at a time when we're concerned about the environment and starving polar bears. So how is this all happening as of right? A type of development which happens without community input, just following the rules, and they move forward. So I realize I'm a little long in the tooth. I'm going to go fast. A lot of buildings in the city can't be built today, 40%, according to the Times. Partly this is because of new codes, ADA accessibility, crowding concerns brought on by Jacob Reese, and new regulations through the city planning department, which, as I mentioned, is in the Equitable Building. We've had a series of a history of improving living standards, right? We went from dumbbell tenement typologies in the lower right, evolving over time, and now how we would reuse that same floor area ratio on a new site. Some of them are now too tall, they're overbuilt, or have too many apartments, or too many businesses. Even despite all this reality, there's very little of the city that's in play in any given year, even though it seems like everything's under construction. So time out for a second, right? Where are we going with this? What about the flora and fauna of Central Park? Who's concerned about that? And what's the responsibility of someone who owns one of these apartments? Once built, these are not going away. As it currently stands from a month ago, more than half of these remain unsold. And they're not even finished, right? Nordstrom's going to be opening later this month. The rest of the building's not finished, but in pre-sales, they're not even sold. The fact is we don't need them, and most people don't want them. So why are we still building them?
Yes,
The reality is money was on the cheap for a very long time, and that's evolving. And maybe pending soon to happen changes in the market, other things that are not too far underway might stop or get pulled. We will see. If you want to look at true density, though, look at the Upper West Side. We're the second densest neighborhood in America, with 166.8 people per acre. The Upper East Side has us beat by almost 4 people per acre.
What is it?
The Upper West Side is 166.8 people per acre, and the Upper East is 170.3. So that's the number 1 and number 2 densest neighborhoods in America. So we don't need a super tall to create density. But we have super talls to create other concerns, right? Safety, right? With the Nordstrom Tower we were just mentioning, that is one of the largest cantilevers ever built by man over the Art Students League, no less. A piece of glass fell, it crushed a security guard and broke someone else's arm. We're all familiar with the Sandy crane, which caused panic in Midtown. Less than a year later, the same crane stalled for hours during a large windstorm.
Oh, yeah.
While it was hoisting concrete for an elevator. In both cases, both sides of the city block had to be shut and evacuated. Imagine getting emergency response to evacuate all these tall buildings during a storm where they're already stretched. So this is just pushing the stereotype that super talls are notoriously built quickly and sloppily.
The Nordstrom, how tall is that going to be?
It's like 19 something, right?
Yeah, something like that.
I will show you where we can find it. It's on our
It's
website.
taller than the 157.
Correct. 157 was Extel's first.
1,005 feet.
Right. This is 1,005. Maybe the other one's like 1,496.
1496, so it'll be taller than,
Oh yeah, it's definitely taller.
taller, well.
It's
it'll be
50.
taller than-
It's in, I think it's in the 1490s because the Stern building is just
so
about
it
1,000.
will literally be taller than the the Freedom Tower,
I think it'll,
minus the spire. Because the Freedom Tower is only 1356 to the
it'll be
spire.
the tallest occupied residential floor in America.
Wow.
And this is one of my favorites. This is from 66th Street, the construction site, where they're just moving so fast. Someone apparently broke their arm in this instance too. I'm not happy they broke their arm, I'm just pointing out it's such a ridiculous photo, making our point. There's such a rush to construct, so what's next? What about once the construction fence is gone and people are walking about everyday innocent pedestrians? This is a headline from 2 or 3 weeks ago, the 200 Amsterdam project where concrete was falling on children on a playground, and the playground's now hit, and they'll be watching videos for the foreseeable future because they can't go outside of their schoolyard. And this speaks for itself, right? And this is partly like we have codes for a reason, right? Building codes are not punishment, they're here to protect users and the public. On March 25th, 1911, 146 workers died when a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And for 90 years, it was the deadliest workplace disaster in the country. But suddenly we want to do workarounds. We don't want to have to deal with following these rules. Right now, there's a proposal to make elevators your option of egress in a case of an emergency. And this has already been tested. And if you go to the Stratosphere in Las Vegas, which is the tallest building in the western half of the country, you are supposed to take the elevator to go down in case of emergency. So why are we rewriting all these rules that we know just to suit a few developers? View, light, air, experience, those are also resources, right? And the infrastructure is here, but the density is crowding and restricting our passage, making the response times longer and more impossible as we get into this vortex of endless stairs. So first responders are endlessly responding, and how do they get away with this? Well, the case in point that we're complaining about, on the left, that block was a 161-foot void. 161 feet, that's taller than the Great Hall at Grand Central, which is 152 feet. So we complained, we brought it to the city, which had already approved this, and the solution was on the right to break that into 3 spaces, and they effectively made it even taller. They did a 64-foot, 64-foot, 48-foot void. So to put that in perspective, 65 foot is a typical cornice line of a brownstone. So this is essentially 2 brownstones stacked and then 48 feet above that, just for mechanical. And the whole point is that once they got their floor area below a threshold, they wanted to raise the views for the upper floors. And this is solely a stilt. And the rules are written in their favor currently. So while they talk about equitable buildings and bringing other people in, at least the YIMBYs do, this was one of my more favorite moments where they were protesting shelters because they don't want poor people living near them. And they were also trying to make it an even more exclusive enclave. So the concept of floor area came with 1961 zoning. This is the latest edition of it. And this introduced a few ideas. TDRs, where you can transfer air rights from another, maybe an individual landmark, for example, across a street or to an adjacent property, so the unused airspace could be realized elsewhere. Zoning lot mergers, where if I join with my neighbor, suddenly we can share the same lot and move like a fluidity of volume of floor area, and just literally dealing with the concept of floor area alone. So if you have FAR1 floor area, you can cover your site 1 time. Mm-hmm. If you have FAR1, you can cover half of your site twice, or you can cover a quarter of your site 4 times. What they don't talk about is how thick that coverage is. I talk about grandma pancakes. So maybe your grandma made pancakes that were a little raw in the middle because they weren't cooked through because they were so fat and thick. Well, you might have 8 grandma pancakes on the left, which would be 8 FAR, and that'll be taller than 20 FAR of crepes. And regulations don't decide how tall that is. There's no 3-dimensional value to FAR. It's only 2-dimensional. On top of this, as the zoning code has been infiltrated by different lobbyist groups and the real estate board, there's a lot of stuff that you can get for free. A cellar, anything that's fully below grade, pipe shafts don't count. Unenclosed patios, something that's less than 67% enclosed, electrical chases, etc. These don't count towards your floor area. So suddenly, a building that is covering the full lot 3 times is not 3 FAR. It's less than, and you have more, and you can keep building it higher. And we're changing the city for useless intentions. YIMBY people claim that density is the goal, but the reality is it's just 2nd, 3rd, and 4th homes for the ultra-rich. We're not creating a solution to the existing housing needs in our city. And these SUPERTALLS don't mitigate any of these issues. More often than not, they're just sweetheart deals for for people to avoid taxes. This is during the campaign trail. This, in fairness, is Iowa. It's not New York, because he's holding sand. So how do these get built? Through excessive mechanical use. So you can look through the building. You'll see some bands. These are double-height bands. So they're what are lit. They're the design features. They're 16'5" each. So that's 32'10" when they're paired of nothing. That's effectively 3 stories of nothing, just as design features. So again, every floor is over 60% larger than a normal floor. And this is built in an area that was in fact downzoned in recent years. So this is old zoning. Nobody intended people to build like this, but the fact is people are building like this, and the reality is city planning has not responded. So 432 Park Avenue is the tallest residential building in the world currently. It'll be supplanted by the Nordstrom Tower, and 2nd tallest in New York. They're also achieving these heights through using voids and stilts. voids within a building. Everybody talks about city core as a building on stilts, and that was from 1973. Well, we haven't really had a building like that since, and they're claiming, well, city core, so these are old rules, we should do it. When you look at the gray, again, that's more void space. So not even a mechanical space, it's just a void. We can have atriums and things like what's that hotel? The Marriott Marquis in Times Square. When it was built, it was the largest enclosed atrium. There's one at the Post. And that's a benefit to the people who are in that building. But when you have a void that's completely inaccessible in a residential building, that's serving nobody from any public or private enjoyment. It's literally just a stilt to give you a better view and increase your personal value. This is, I know, hard to see, but a gerrymandered zoning lot. This is the 39-sided zoning lot that was used on a superblock site to create 200 Amsterdam, which is now this. I know I'm a little behind. And fake buildings. So this is what the developer filed for the site where we're looking at the tallest building on the island of Manhattan, north of 59th, 60th Street. They filed a 26-story building that nobody would blink an eye at. By combining sites on the left, those were 3 sites used by ABC for set storage because they used to film their soap operas here, Congregation Habonim, and air rights from an individual landmark, the First Battery Armory, which stands and it's currently ESPN's headquarters. Not only did they clear the site, the building just south of it, or up in the picture, was the Jewish Guild for the Blind. Another nonprofit. They struck a deal with them, bought that site, merged it, and by using a community facility bonus, which allows them to not only cover the site as much as they want, but then add to that by providing a community facility. And this bonus was put in place so people would have access to doctors, daycares, things close to home so they didn't all have to go to the hospital every time. Instead, this is being used as a loophole to gut nonprofits and get them to agree to move into the basements or cellars where they're not even paying for floor area, so that they could build higher. And in this case, the developer acquired the land much more cheaply by doing this. And they were creating a 90-foot basement, so effectively 9 stories underground.
Who is the developer?
Extel. So this, again, was the massing of the original site under demolition, the foundation bathtub, and the rendering. And you have to imagine that more than a third of that vertical height is nothing. There's 239 feet of void in that vertical rise. And that's mainly from this point with this Spanish steps and the pool amenity floor upwards for that 64-48 gap. And mind you, this entire building, which is through block, occupying what had been 5 sites, but if you're going by a 25-foot lot, it was 5 or 6 sites on each block, will be for 127 apartments.
That's it? Wow. So what, can I ask you, the void, why did they just put more apartments in there?
Because of the multiple dwelling law. They don't have the
No.
floor area. You can't put,
They can build tall.
Number 4 is.
if you put another floor in, you're paying for it in floor area. So every time, so from the developer standpoint, they want to put the floor higher so they can make more money out of it. The metrics have gone so reversed that the land acquisition cost, clearing the site cost, and building a void makes more sense because you have such greater income to
So
recoup.
it has to do with area of living space.
Floor
Living-
area.
floor
There's only so
area.
many pancakes you can make.
Okay.
So this was another great moment. John Calico, another developer, said a different developer did something smart at a site we looked at on West 67th Street. He meant 66th, that's a typo, but that's what he said. These are the kind, and he talked about, he filed a building this big, but he's intending to build a building this big. I cut it out there. These are the kinds of tricks you have to do these days, and if you hope to be successful, so you have to trick the community. So again, this is completely as of right, no community input, no community board review. This was a view of what it was initially supposed to be, some of the neighbors that were working with different organizations, and the rendering of the site with its just void, grossly out of proportion with its context.
Why was there not community board review or other?
Because they didn't have to, it was as of right.
That's
They can
Okay.
self-certify. So this is a view of the shadows on June 21st. It will almost reach the Children's Zoo in Central Park. There have been great moments with Pat Kiernan even doing the football play-by-play, making fun of how ridiculous this building is. And currently we're right now at the Board of Standards and Appeals. We paid king's ransom for an expediter to get the original plans. There's over 1,000 sheets, and they're unnecessarily filled, but there's no real equipment there. There's no there. And so they were charged by the Board of Standards and Appeals to do a takeoff of justifying all of the mechanical equipment and the space around it, right? Well, mechanical equipment's usually designed so someone can access it and service it. They're not going to create a 5-story boiler, a 64-foot boiler. And I literally just skimmed it as I left, but the DOB is like, nope, everything's great. We haven't seen the drawings that were provided. They might have come since. So stay tuned to that. But we've been working in the press. This is Dick Gottfried on the right, Ben Kalos. They've both been very forward in pushing the agenda to curb the SUPERTALLS. Anytime we're on news, displaying all of the dirty money that's coming from Kazakhstan in this, and right, fighting this at both the Department of Buildings level, presenting and showing them how ridiculous they are, not even following their own rules that they state, and also challenging it at the Board of Standards and Appeals. This is the void I showed you, and just again, a void is literally the height of a brownstone building. So as this is a little bit of a dated photo. They've got it up to street level right now, but it really is the Upper West Side's Grand Canyon. And I know I'm at time, so I'm going to be wrapping up in 2 quick minutes here. All is not lost. There is hope. City planning has taken an action on voids. So instead of having a large mechanical void, now they're allowing you to have a 25-foot void and have it repeatable after 75 foot of floor area. The problem is 75 foot of floor area can be 1 floor. And 25 feet is still ridiculous. That's 2.5 stories. Because the city won't do it, the state is doing it. That's Senator Jackson and Assemblymember Linda Rosenthal. These bill numbers will change because they have to be reintroduced in January in a new session. And if you want to take a moment, we have a change.org petition that's on our website. If you go to the center tab under advocacy, you'll see a SUPERTALL tab. It's linked in a few different places. It sends every time we get another 500 people an announcement to everybody on the housing committee that this is coming up. And it's a little bit of an uphill battle at the state because most of the state is not New York City. And the people who are in other parts of the state where we're making Chobani and Faye and yogurt's the only game in town don't really care about how dense New York is developed. And what this would do is this would create a 3-dimensional value to floor area and create height limits. So after a large 20 or 25 foot, I have to reread it, base, you can have larger space, but you're counting it in greater quantities against your floor area. So what to do as a general citizen? Pay attention to your neighborhood nonprofit, your citywide nonprofit. Follow what's going on at the community board. There's a great meeting tonight about a building at 96th Street in the Upper West Side, but I'm here with you happily. And just talk to your local council member. They usually have an open door policy. They have office hours. Just stop in, be a nudge, as my mom would say. You can sign up for emails. Usually they're free. It doesn't matter if you're a member or not. Read them. And then be active with that group. You can also talk at meetings, join a committee. There's a lot of online platforms to share your ideas or comment in a lot of these other platforms. And lastly, you can initiate action. You can sign these petitions and you can just keep calling people and sharing the ideas so people know. If you want more information on any of this, this is a pretty heavy website. But if you go to it, we have examples of all the West Side developments on the right, and then below that, past SUPERTALLS in New York, and then planned ones elsewhere in the city. But it goes through the history of development, what advocates are doing about it, what you can do as well.
What happened after the option after setbacks? Then, okay, you could build it, but you have to provide public space. I don't see public space around.
So not all of those, there was a program called the POPS program, privately owned public spaces. So there was an attitude at city planning that you could build higher by giving back some of the street to the public. And the reality is a lot of the advocates are against those right now. And that's partly because there's no oversight. There's no regulation of how to maintain those.
You mentioned, what I'm trying to think, is that a lot of SUPERTALLS that they're building so many of them because they have all of these developers have all of these people who are around the world who are giving them money to invest. what we're perhaps seeing here is what happened on a smaller scale, what happens in Florida every so often. You know, you overbuild and you can't sell it, so they crash. You know,
I own one.
a lot of these buildings that are built now, remember this, that in 10 or 15 or 20 years, they may become old hat already. Because remember what happened in the 60s when they developed the east side, east of 3rd Avenue, after the 3rd Avenue L was torn down. You had all of these white brick apartment houses built, you know, with the
Summer
doorway and
landmarks,
everything
yeah.
else. And they were the cream of the crop of the housing stock at that time, you know, because they were the latest kid on the block. Now, they're old hat. They don't have the concierge, they don't have the gym in there, they don't have all the
The
other
virtual
playthings.
golf, the wine cellar,
The wine, yeah, whatever.
the
the
petting
whole thing.
zoo.
Yeah, so the rents there, believe it or not, a lot of the rents on the Upper East Side in that area are lower than they are in Dumbo or in parts of Brooklyn.
Yeah, no, Dumbo's supplanted as the rich.
Oh, yeah, forget it, they're up there.
It's still noisy in Dunwoody, you got the subway train going. But
Triple glazer
a
windows.
point about what you're talking about with building, I have a condo in Miami, and they, if you build a building, and they're overbuilding again, it's just another wave, you have to have a garage space for each person. No consideration as to when all these people come out of their apartments, come out of their cars, and get onto the streets. You just can't move. It's just like gridlock. So I think Sao Paulo or some city in Brazil had the same problem. They just grew like crazy, but didn't think about the streets because there's no subways in Miami. You know, there's very
No, and they're not
there's no
going,
little mass
you're not gonna see,
transportation.
you're not gonna see that in Miami.
No, you can't. It's water. But I'm just saying the visions are so short-sighted.
Well, it's also piecemeal, right? This is
Yeah.
not a city-driven initiative. This
You're not gonna
is
see
developer-driven.
subways here in New York anymore.
And the city's really been laissez-faire about what happens. City planning has not taken a position. They only came up with this limiting the void space because all the advocates were complaining. And right now, phase 2, they're looking at 5 new areas. Hudson Yards, housing, Midtown, Lower Manhattan, Long Island City, and downtown Brooklyn. And we're not taking a position because we're the Upper West Side about regulating the voids. And the reality is they're looking at proposing a 35-foot void. Well, why is 25-foot, which is already egregious, appropriate elsewhere, and this 35-foot? They're really just kowtowing to what the real estate board and the developers want.
Back to this gentleman's question, like, what about the neighborhood? And you said it was self-certified? What exactly does that mean?
A developer can just say, I comply with everything. I meet
His
the
architect, so.
Yeah.
The architect is certified. But it's because,
That's also-
the zoning will allow them to do what they wanna do, and that's why it's as of right.
This is all about
It doesn't
expediting the
require a
process.
variance.
You're right, exactly. It's following the setback rules, it's following the lot coverage rules. It's all about moving construction forward. We don't want to hamper development.
But these buildings have no setback, basically, that are going up. They really don't.
Or public space.
But you would indicate that, and I've seen not just what you had said, but I've seen elsewhere where they're having a hard time selling these apartments because people, they actually don't like being that high.
Well, if you're so high, you don't even, they're having a problem at 432 because when you're sitting that high and you're on your couch, you don't even see the city.
Yeah, and so do you think, I mean,
It's terrifying.
supply, demand, no demand, do you think that
Just seeing the sky, that's
make
scary.
people reel in?
You get, if you're high enough, clouds actually come and settle on the building. So 432
Well,
Park Avenue, you look up, sometimes you can't see the top. It's
Well,
inside.
I was
that's
in the, I've only been to the top of Freedom Tower once. And that observation that goes around, and it was a cloudy day. And we couldn't see the ground. Because we were in a cloud.
But
It was a
there's been
fog.
no discussion about the shade at all, of these buildings.
Well, shadows don't, it's a non-starter with the city agencies. Nobody's regulating it. And while other areas have protect the view, protect the light, New York doesn't. And the Central Park Conservancy hasn't been against this. And the new head of it made a deal with one of the developers that every time a unit is sold, they give the new owner a $25,000 level membership. So not only does the developer get a tax credit, excuse me,
You give the owner, what owner?
the buyer of that unit
Yes.
is now a $25,000 member of the conservancy. So, and the hope is this is their mailing list, and the hope is that they will re-up every year.
Plus I know from,
Oh, wow,
elsewhere
that's good.
that they get most of their money from the people who live around.
Directly at the periphery.
Interesting.
But do you think
They
that
should
the
be-
market, given that people don't wanna live that high
They should
up,
be
Yeah,
will
stewards, and
make
instead
them?
they're not.
I mean,
What
if
I'm
happens
sure
it's-
there's plenty of
if they
people
don't
who do
occupy
want to
the
live
well,
that
they're not
high.
in town, they won't.
Why would they?
No, they're,
Like, who's going to pay to
Just
do
leave
it?
it there.
I don't know.
no,
Let's see.
they're gonna drop the
won't be.
prices and people will come.
When 157 opened, there was already so many pre-sales because there was hype about that, and people already were trying to buy into the Central Park Tower, which is still not finished. And I think now people see what they are, and I don't know. Part of the problem is maybe we need to rediscover philanthropy in this country or in the world. But the reality is people just have so much money and they don't know what to do with it right now.
Yeah. I've also heard that a lot of, but this is kind of just rumor that I've heard, but like a lot of the towers in Hudson Yards and things, really wealthy foreign people will come in, buy a unit, and leave it unoccupied simply as a real estate investment or in case one of their children comes to
Right.
New York to do business in the future or something like that. So even though these are owned and technically occupied, nobody is ever in them. It's just a waste of space.
So it actually long-term kills the community. They're
Well,
dominating.
we're in a rather, in a dilemma, because it isn't just the foreigners, it's also rich millennials who come in and.
They're spending all their money on avocados.
We have
No,
more
what it
buildings.
is that,
Yeah.
and if you talk to these kids, talk to these people, you realize that they look upon landmarking as really something that's beyond them, you know.
Wasn't,
Well, they don't-
wasn't
Old-
there city
history.
You know, old
or-
furniture, a piano like that, I guess it's.
Oh, forget it.
That's brown furniture, can't,
He's right.
that's it.
only brown.
Brown.
Anything that
I don't
has
like brown.
mahogany, no good.
But wasn't the
You're-
city
you're dealing with
considering
a
instituting
People
a
you
users
can't really
fee?
communicate.
I've only seen that come up at
Everything
times.
has to be
There's never been a
supplied.
view tax proposed at a real level.
Super minimalist.
Antiques have just plummeted
Oh,
in value because
of
nobody
course.
honors the past,
You get it.
history.
So hopefully the takeaway is that there is a what, not just so what.
Zoning can't protect you.
Zoning won't protect. It
It
could,
won't.
it could,
Yeah.
but it won't.
It won't, it won't.
Any counter arguments from the millennials?
Counter arguments?
Come on, come on, come on, come on.
I'm a millennial.
Clearly not one of them, so.
I don't even know what a millennial is. I guess I probably am one.
Yes.
Anyone born from
I've heard brown
1980
furniture is actually on the rise.
Right, 80s.
Brown furniture is back.
Yeah.